Imagine waking up in 1960 to a world where the swastika flies over the Atlantic, where the German language echoes through the streets of New York, where children are taught in schools bearing names like Adolf Hitler Academy, and where the greatest atrocity in human history became the blueprint for a global empire. This is the chilling alternate reality we must confront today, a world that came terrifyingly close to becoming our actual past. The year is 1945, and Adolf Hitler sits in his underground bunker as the Soviet army closes in, as American forces push through the Rhine, as the carefully constructed thousand-year Reich crumbles under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet, in this moment of absolute defeat, we must ask ourselves, what if the dice had fallen differently? What if Hitler had won? What if the Nazi regime, instead of collapsing in 1945, had managed to consolidate power across Europe, to achieve nuclear weapons before the Allies, to negotiate a separate peace that left Germany as the dominant continental power? The answer to this question is not merely an academic exercise in alternative history. It is a profound meditation on the fragility of civilization, on how close the world came to eternal darkness, and on the choices that separating victory from defeat were often terrifyingly thin. To understand how Hitler might have won, we must first rewind the historical tape and examine the critical junctures where alternative outcomes were not just possible, but plausible, where decisions made in smoke-filled rooms and on blood-soaked battlefields could have tilted the world toward an entirely different future. We begin our journey into this alternate timeline not with the war's beginning in 1939, but with the pivotal decisions that shaped its trajectory from the very first. Moments of conflict, for it was in the early stages of World War II that German military superiority was most pronounced. When German forces faced opponents who were unprepared, disorganized, and fractured by competing political agendas, the conquest of Poland in September 1939 demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of German military innovation. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a revolutionary concept that combined fast-moving armor columns with air superiority and coordinated infantry support to shatter enemy defenses and encircle vast armies in a matter of days or weeks. The horrified world watched as the Polish army, brave and determined but equipped with outdated weapons and tactics designed for the previous century's style of warfare, was crushed in just 3 weeks. The nation partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union according to a secret protocol attached to the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed just weeks before. The fall of France in 1940, which stunned the world and left Britain standing alone against Nazi tyranny, was another moment where alternative outcomes seemed possible. Imagine if Hitler had successfully invaded Britain as he had planned. If the German Luftwaffe had managed to achieve air superiority over the Channel. If the Royal Navy had been weakened more severely before the planned invasion. If British resolve had wavered and Churchill's government had been overthrown by negotiators willing to make peace with Hitler. Consider the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was meant to deliver a swift knockout blow to Stalin's regime, to capture the vast agricultural and mineral wealth of Russia, and to provide the Lebensraum, or living space, that Nazi ideology insisted Germany desperately needed. The early months saw stunning German victories, with Wehrmacht forces advancing hundreds of kilometers, encircling Soviet armies by the hundreds of thousands, and seemingly on the verge of reaching Moscow before winter fell. But Hitler made a catastrophic strategic error. He divided his forces, pushing toward Moscow, the Caucasus, and the Baltic simultaneously, rather than concentrating overwhelming power at a single point. In our actual history, the Soviets held Moscow by a hair's breadth, and the winter of 1941 to 1942 halted the German advance, beginning a grueling war of attrition that would ultimately prove unwinnable for the Nazis. But imagine if Hitler had listened to his generals, if he had concentrated all available forces on a single thrust toward Moscow, if the brutal efficiency of the Wehrmacht had broken Soviet resistance before winter made such movement impossible, the Soviet leadership was genuinely terrified of losing Moscow. Stalin had prepared evacuation plans and was prepared to surrender if the military situation became truly hopeless. With Moscow captured, with Stalin potentially killed or forced to flee eastward beyond the Urals, the psychological and strategic advantage would have been overwhelming. The Soviet Union would have been fractured, possibly forced to negotiate a peace that left Germany controlling all of European Russia west of the Urals. Historians studying this critical juncture have noted that the margin between victory and defeat was extraordinarily thin. In some accounts, German forces came within sight of the Kremlin walls, and only determined Soviet counteroffensives and the arrival of fresh troops from Siberia, combined with the brutal winter weather that German soldiers were unprepared to face, prevented a Soviet collapse. In this alternate timeline, where Moscow falls in late 1941 or early 1942, the entire course of the war would have been transformed, and Germany would have possessed the resources and territory needed to resist the Western Allies indefinitely. At the same time, in our alternate timeline, imagine that Germany's nuclear weapons program, which lagged significantly behind the Allies' Manhattan Project, had instead received the proper funding and scientific talent from the regime's beginning. The physics was well understood. German scientists like Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn had made fundamental discoveries about nuclear fission, and if Hitler's regime had prioritized the development of atomic weapons with the same obsessive dedication it brought to other military projects, Germany might have produced a working nuclear device by 1944 or even 1943. The actual historical German nuclear program suffered from several critical failures. Hitler distrusted theoretical physics and the Jewish science of quantum mechanics. Viewing it as a potential threat to Nazi racial ideology, the regime persecuted and drove into exile many of the country's best physicists, including Einstein himself, who had fled Germany in 1933. German scientists and military planners disagreed about whether a bomb was feasible in the time frame of the war, and resources were diverted to other weapons programs that seemed more immediately promising. In our alternate timeline, none of these obstacles would have impeded progress. Imagine a Germany where scientific merit trumped ideological purity, where the best minds were retained and protected, where atomic research received top priority and unlimited funding, where German scientists achieved the crucial breakthrough in enriching uranium or producing plutonium before their American counterparts. By 1944 or 1945, Germany might have possessed one or even several nuclear weapons, and the strategic implications would have been staggering. With atomic weapons in its arsenal, with Moscow secured and the Soviet Union knocked out of the war by 1943, Germany would have faced a dramatically weakened opposition in the West. Britain, already nearly defeated and surviving only through American support, crippled by the German Blitz that had devastated its cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, its economy in tatters from years of total war mobilization, its population exhausted by years of bombing and rationing, might have negotiated a separate peace with a triumphant Germany, especially if Hitler had shown any willingness to offer terms that preserved British imperial interests overseas and allowed the British Empire to continue its role as a colonial power in India, Africa, and Asia. Without Soviet forces, and with a defeated Britain, the United States would have faced an impossible strategic situation, attempting to invade and defeat a Germany that now controlled the entire European continent, that possessed atomic weapons and the means to deliver them against American cities, and that had the industrial capacity to wage unlimited war indefinitely. The American public, having already suffered through years of war, facing the prospect of nuclear devastation in their own homeland, might well have concluded that further conflict was not worth the cost, especially with an opponent that could now threaten American cities with nuclear annihilation. The American military establishment would have calculated the probable casualties of a direct invasion of a Nazi-controlled Europe. Estimates suggested that such an invasion could cost 1,000,000 American lives, and this number would have become even more horrifying in the context of nuclear weapons, as a single atomic bomb could kill hundreds of thousands of people. In such a scenario, the United States might have negotiated a settlement that accepted German hegemony over Europe in exchange for German acceptance of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. The two superpowers, a Nazi Germany and a still isolated America, would have divided the world between them, perhaps with the Japanese Empire controlling a third sphere in Asia, creating a tripolar world far more unstable than the actual bipolar Cold War that emerged. Such an outcome would have been catastrophic beyond measure. But let us examine more carefully what such a Nazi victory would have meant for human civilization, and what kind of world would have emerged from such a nightmare. First, we must understand that Nazi ideology was not some aberration, some temporary madness that would have been corrected with time and enlightenment. It was the carefully crafted philosophical foundation of the entire regime, as binding and fundamental as the ideology that justified Soviet communism or American capitalism. The racial pseudoscience on which Nazism was based, rooted in the discredited theories of social Darwinism and the pseudoscientific racial classification systems developed in the 19th century. The conception of history as a struggle between superior and inferior races, the belief that the German Aryan people represented the pinnacle of human evolution and had the right and duty to dominate or eliminate all other peoples, these were not negotiable political positions to the Nazi elite, but sacred truths that would have guided every policy decision in a victorious Nazi state. The Nazi worldview was not pragmatic or flexible. It was doctrinaire and absolute in its demands, and it would not have been softened by victory but hardened and amplified by it. Thus, in a world where Hitler won, the Holocaust would not have ended in 1945, but would have accelerated and expanded into something even more apocalyptic than it actually was. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews would have been merely the beginning of a much larger campaign of genocide that would have consumed tens of millions of people deemed racially unfit or politically unreliable. The Nazis had already prepared detailed plans for the elimination of the Slavic peoples, whom they regarded as subhuman races that existed only to serve German masters. The conquered territories of Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and the Baltic states would have become vast open-air laboratories for Nazi racial engineering, populated by Germanic settler colonists, while the native populations were either enslaved to brutal living conditions and forced labor camps, expelled to even more remote territories, or systematically exterminated through mass shootings, starvation, disease, or gas chambers perfected and industrialized to unprecedented levels of efficiency. The estimates of how many people would have died in such a scenario are almost incomprehensible. Historians have suggested that somewhere between 100 and 300 million Slavic people, along with millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, homosexuals, and anyone else deemed undesirable by the regime, would have been murdered over the course of the following decades. The Nazis did not envision a short period of conquest followed by a return to normality. They were committed to a centuries-long process of transforming the entire racial composition of Europe through violence and systematic annihilation. Nazi racial planning documents, which have been preserved and examined by modern historians, describe in chilling detail the process by which German settlers would gradually replace the native Slavic populations, how generations would pass before the Germanization of Eastern Europe was complete, how the landscape itself would be transformed to reflect German racial ideals. Cities would be renamed with Germanic names. The cultural heritage of subjugated peoples would be systematically destroyed. Languages would be suppressed. Any manifestation of national identity among conquered peoples would be ruthlessly crushed. Beyond the immediate horror of genocide, a Nazi-dominated world would have represented a catastrophic reversal of all human progress toward democracy, individual rights, and human dignity that had been slowly achieved through centuries of struggle and Enlightenment thought. The totalitarian system perfected by Hitler, complete surveillance of the population through secret police networks that would have made the Soviet Union's security apparatus seem primitive by comparison, the elimination of any independent civil society or institutions that could potentially resist state authority, the total mobilization of all social institutions towards state goals, the systematic propaganda and indoctrination of the population from birth through adulthood and into old age, the pervasive climate of fear and denunciation that would have turned families and friends into potential informants would have been imposed across all of Europe and potentially across the globe. Individual human beings would have existed not as citizens with rights or autonomous agents capable of making meaningful choices, but as cells within the vast organism of the state, their entire existence dictated by the needs of the racial community. The systematic terror that characterized Nazi rule in occupied Europe, the random arrests in the dead of night by Gestapo agents, the torture in Gestapo basements and concentration camps, the disappearances of suspected enemies of the state, the public executions and displays of severed heads on pikes meant to instill obedience through fear, the collective punishment of entire villages for the actions of individual resistance fighters would have become the normal condition of human existence for hundreds of millions of people. The security apparatus of the regime would have become ever more sophisticated and penetrating, with informants and spies in every neighborhood, every workplace, every school, and every family unit. In a world with modern surveillance technology, the Nazis would have created a panopticon of unprecedented scope, where every word spoken and every action taken could potentially be reported to the authorities. The great universities of Europe, which had been centers of intellectual inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge for centuries, would have been transformed into instruments of Nazi propaganda, with all teaching and research subordinated to the regime's ideological requirements. Historians would have been forced to rewrite history to glorify German accomplishments and denigrate all other peoples. Philosophers would have been required to develop increasingly elaborate justifications for Nazi racial theory. Mathematicians and physicists would have been expected to ensure that their discoveries served the needs of the German state. Any researcher who questioned the regime's racial theories, who suggested that the scientific evidence might contradict Nazi doctrine, who failed to sufficiently demonstrate loyalty to the regime's ideological vision, would have faced persecution, dismissal from their position, or death. The sciences themselves would have been distorted. Fields like biology, anthropology, and even physics would have been forced to serve the demands of racial pseudoscience, and research programs would have been designed not to discover truth, but to validate predetermined ideological conclusions. The great works of human culture and art would have been destroyed or perverted. Anything that did not serve the glory of the Nazi racial community would have been eliminated, whether it was the modernist art movements that the Nazis branded as degenerate and inferior, the music of Jewish composers whose works the regime deemed unworthy of performance, or the literature of any writer who dared to suggest that all humans were equal or who did not celebrate German racial superiority. In our actual world, the defeat of Hitler and the subsequent Cold War between democratic and communist superpowers led eventually to decolonization, to the end of formal imperialism, and to the emergence of a global community of independent nations, however imperfectly realized. In a Nazi-dominated world, this entire trajectory would have been reversed. The Nazis would have consolidated a continental empire in Europe and would have turned their gaze outward to the wider world, seeking to complete the global racial reorganization of humanity. The regime would have viewed the entire globe as its rightful domain and would have pursued policies of racial reorganization and domination across all continents. The Western Hemisphere, eventually, would have come under Nazi pressure, and the comfortable American assumption that we could ignore the ideological struggles of the wider world would have been shattered by the rise of a Nazi superpower across the Atlantic Ocean. The Nazis would have cultivated fascist movements in Latin America, would have supported military coups and authoritarian regimes, would have gradually extended their influence and control over the Americas. The Japanese Empire, which, in our actual history, was defeated after a brutal conflict with the United States and subsequently transformed into a pacifist democracy, might have carved out a parallel Asian sphere under Japanese racial domination, creating a bipolar world divided between German and Japanese racial empires, each dominant in its own hemisphere. These two powers, sharing similar racial ideologies and authoritarian structures, but competing for global dominance, would have eventually come into conflict over control of Africa, the Middle East, and other contested regions. Technology and science, twisted in the service of totalitarian racial ideology, would have advanced in terrifying directions. The Nazis were already well along in developing new weapons technologies, including ballistic missiles, supersonic aircraft, and other instruments of destruction. And with victory and unlimited resources, these weapons programs would have reached fruition and surpassed anything the actual world has seen. The prospect of a global nuclear war fought between Nazi and Japanese racial empires, or between a future American resistance and a Nazi-dominated world, would have hung over human civilization like a perpetual sword of Damocles, far more dangerous and unstable than even the tense Cold War that actually occurred. The development of ballistic missiles capable of delivering atomic warheads across continents would have made the world far more dangerous, with multiple totalitarian powers possessing the capacity to annihilate each other and all of humanity in a matter of hours. The environmental devastation that would have resulted from Nazi racial and economic policies would have been staggering. The Nazis had already begun implementing policies of ecological destruction in Eastern Europe, viewing nature itself as a resource to be exploited without restraint for the glory of the German racial state, and this philosophy would have been extended across an entire continent and potentially across the entire globe. Forests would have been clear-cut to fuel industry and provide space for German settlements. Rivers would have been polluted by industrial waste and Nazi experiments. Wildlife would have been driven to extinction or hunted to near extinction. Entire ecosystems would have been transformed or destroyed in pursuit of racial and economic objectives. The cultural and spiritual devastation would have been equally profound and long-lasting. The regime's systematic attempt to replace traditional religions with a new Nazi pagan religion, synthesized from Germanic mythology and pseudo-scientific racial theory, to eliminate Christian teaching that suggested all humans were equal before God and deserving of equal dignity, to transform human consciousness itself into an instrument of the totalitarian state, would have succeeded in a way that would have taken generations to reverse. The regime was actively developing its own pseudo-religious ceremonies and mythology, creating new rituals and festivals designed to replace traditional Christian observances. And in a victorious Nazi state with unlimited resources and time, this spiritual transformation of an entire continent would have been successfully completed. The Nazis would have suppressed or eliminated Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and all other traditional religions, replacing them with a state-mandated ideology that deified the leader, celebrated racial superiority, and subordinated individual conscience to the needs of the state. The resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for resistance and rebellion that allowed some degree of cultural continuity even under Soviet totalitarianism, might have been broken by the systematic terror and total control of the Nazi regime, leaving a humanity demoralized, spiritually broken, and incapable of imagining a world different from the one in which they were forced to live. The psychological effects of living under such total totalitarian control would have been devastating. Entire generations would have been born and raised under Nazi rule, knowing nothing of freedom, democracy, or human rights, trained from birth to view themselves and the world through the lens of Nazi racial ideology. Yet even in this darkest of alternate histories, the seeds of the regime's eventual downfall might have been sown from the very beginning. For the Nazi system, like all totalitarian systems, contained fundamental contradictions that would eventually undermine it. The regime's complete subordination of all economic activity to military purposes would have prevented the development of the consumer economy that might have increased living standards for the German population and created a materially satisfied populace, less inclined toward dissent. Eventually, even in Germany, the population would have grown tired of endless sacrifice to the state, endless mobilization for military adventures, endless demands for loyalty and ideological purity. The regime's systematic elimination of its most talented people, the persecution of scientists and intellectuals who question Nazi ideology, the death of millions of skilled workers in brutal labor camps and military campaigns, the waste of enormous human potential on genocidal adventures and pointless wars of conquest, would have eventually crippled Germany's economic and technological capacity to compete in a rapidly changing world. The regime's racist ideology, which divided humanity into hierarchies of superior and inferior races, would have poisoned all international relations and made it impossible to build any stable political order based on mutual respect and shared interests. The world conquered by the Nazis would have been a world of perpetual conflict and rebellion, as subjugated peoples constantly resisted their oppression. The systematic propaganda and indoctrination that the regime relied upon would have required increasingly brutal enforcement, as reality inevitably failed to conform to the utopian promises of Nazi ideology. The 1,000-year Reich would have discovered within just a few generations that the promised racial utopia was as distant as ever, that human nature stubbornly resisted Nazi efforts to transform it, and that the dream of a harmonious racial community was fundamentally at odds with the reality of human diversity and individual desire for freedom. Looking at this alternate timeline forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths about our actual history and about the human condition itself. First, it reminds us that the defeat of Hitler was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people, of the courage of soldiers who fought against overwhelming odds, of the intelligence failures that prevented Germany from developing atomic weapons first, of the unwillingness of ordinary people under Nazi rule to entirely surrender their humanity to the demands of the state. The world we inhabit today, for all its many flaws and injustices, is vastly superior to the nightmare world that would have existed had Hitler prevailed. And we must never forget that this superiority was achieved through the sacrifice of millions of people who fought and died to prevent that darkness from consuming the world. Second, it reminds us that totalitarian ideologies, though they may offer seductive promises of order and greatness, inevitably lead to degradation, terror, and ultimately to the destruction of the very communities they claim to serve. The Nazi regime promised Germans a 1,000-year empire, unprecedented greatness, a place in a glorious new order. What it delivered was humiliation, defeat, and the moral condemnation of an entire nation for generations to come. Third, it reminds us that the values we take for granted, democracy, individual rights, the rule of law, the principle that all human beings have equal dignity regardless of race or ethnicity, are not natural or inevitable developments of human civilization, but hard-won achievements that must, be constantly defended and renewed, for they can be lost to history if we become complacent or apathetic. The fragility of civilization, the thinness of the walls that separate order from chaos, democracy from tyranny, is perhaps the most important lesson that the alternate history of a victorious Hitler teaches us. In our actual world, Hitler's defeat came at a cost that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died in World War II, including the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Entire regions of Europe and Asia were devastated. Economies were shattered, and the survivors carried psychological and physical scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet despite this staggering cost, the victory over Hitler was absolutely necessary. For the alternative, a world in which he had succeeded, would have been so much worse that even the apocalyptic scale of the actual war seems preferable to it. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy, who fought through the frozen landscapes of the Eastern Front, who died in the Pacific Island campaigns, who served in the home front, supporting the war effort, they understood, consciously or unconsciously, that they were fighting not merely for territorial interests or national supremacy, but for the very soul of human civilization, for the principle that human beings had the right to live in freedom, dignity, and self-determination, rather than as slaves to a totalitarian racial state. The leaders who made the decision to continue the fight despite enormous costs, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, whatever their flaws and whatever disagreements existed between them, understood that there were some evils so great that they had to be opposed regardless of the cost, and that appeasement, compromise, or negotiation with such evil would not bring peace, but only the perpetuation of tyranny. As we look back across the decades that separate us from World War II, as we examine the evidence of what the Nazis actually did, as we contemplate the far more horrific scenario of what they would have done had they achieved complete victory, we must resolve ourselves to remain vigilant against the emergence of similar ideologies in our own time. The warning signs of totalitarian movements, the scapegoating of minorities, the appeal to a mythical past of national greatness, the dehumanization of those deemed to be inferior or dangerous, the promise that one strong leader can solve all problems, the subordination of individual rights to the needs of the state, the systematic propaganda that rewrites reality to serve political purposes. These warning signs are not historical artifacts, but potential present dangers that must be recognized and resisted whenever they emerge. The alternate world where Hitler won is a world we must study not out of morbid fascination, but out of a determination that such a world must never come to pass. That the lessons of the actual horror that did occur are sufficient to teach us the necessity of eternal vigilance, that democracy and human rights, though imperfectly realized, are worth defending with all the resources and determination at our command. The actual history of World War II, with all its suffering and tragedy, was a history in which the forces of democracy and human dignity ultimately prevailed, in which the fundamental principle that all humans deserve equal treatment and respect won out over the Nazi vision of a world divided into masters and slaves, and that victory, hard-won and costly though it was, stands as one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. To study the alternate history of Hitler's victory is to understand, with absolute clarity, why that actual victory mattered so profoundly, why the sacrifices made in pursuit of it were not only justified, but necessary, and why we must continue to defend the values for which so many died against any force, whether foreign or domestic, that seeks to undermine them. The world we live in today, with all its problems and challenges, is the world that was preserved by the defeat of Hitler, and we must never forget the price that was paid for that preservation, nor allow ourselves to become so comfortable or complacent that we fail to recognize and resist the totalitarian impulses that can emerge in new forms in each generation. To truly understand the implications of a victorious Nazi Germany, we must also consider how this alternate world would have affected the rest of the globe. The United States, in such a scenario, would have been transformed from a beacon of democratic hope into an increasingly militarized state, confronted by a Nazi hegemon wielding both conventional military superiority and nuclear weapons. The American public would have faced a choice: accept a negotiated peace that preserved Nazi hegemony in Europe, or face nuclear annihilation in defense of principles that the war-weary population might have been convinced were not worth such a terrible cost. The psychological impact of living as the second superpower in a world dominated by Nazi ideology would have been corrosive to American democracy itself. The constant threat posed by the Nazi regime might have led to the emergence of authoritarian movements within the United States, as Americans convinced themselves that they needed a strong leader to match Hitler's power, that democratic principles were a luxury they could no longer afford. The technological development that actually led to the space age, the Internet, and countless other innovations that emerged from competition with the Soviet Union would never have occurred in a world divided between American and Nazi superpowers. Instead, the resources of the world's scientists and engineers would have been devoted to producing ever more efficient weapons of mass destruction. The intellectual landscape of the world would have been fundamentally impoverished by the Nazi victory. Thousands of scholars, artists, writers, and scientists would have been killed or silenced, their potential contributions to human knowledge lost forever. The libraries of Europe, which contained thousands of years of accumulated human wisdom and culture, would have been ransacked and destroyed, with anything deemed ideologically unacceptable burned in the vast bonfires that the Nazis loved to organize. The history of science itself would have been rewritten to remove any contributions from peoples deemed racially inferior, and entire fields of knowledge would have been suppressed because they contradicted Nazi racial ideology. The psychological trauma inflicted on the peoples of Europe would have been immeasurable and long-lasting, even if totalitarian rule eventually collapsed under its own contradictions. As many historians believe it eventually would have, the recovery from such massive trauma would have taken generations. The moral authority of the Western world, which emerged from the defeat of Hitler as a force for good in the world, would never have existed. There would have been no Marshall Plan to rebuild defeated enemies, no Declaration of Universal Human Rights, no international institutions dedicated to preventing genocide and protecting human dignity. Instead, the world would have been a darker, crueler place, where might made right, where the strong oppressed the weak without restraint, where human rights were meaningless concepts dismissed as the naive fantasies of inferior peoples. The lessons of the Holocaust, which have shaped international law and moral philosophy since 1945, would never have been learned. The world would have been left to its worst instincts, with no clear moral beacon to guide it toward justice and humanity. Looking forward from such an alternate 1945, we can envision the trajectory of the following decades with a clarity born of understanding what the Nazis actually believed and actually planned. The regime, having achieved complete victory in Europe, and the near-complete subordination of Japan through superior military power and nuclear weapons, would have turned its attention to consolidating its vast empire and ensuring that no power could ever challenge their supremacy again. The systematic terror would have intensified rather than diminished, as the leadership, paranoid from their own totalitarian experiences, understood that any potential rival or dissident was a threat to eternal Nazi rule and needed to be identified and eliminated before they could pose a danger. The racial reorganization of Eastern Europe would have proceeded with industrialized efficiency, with entire populations shipped to labor camps or execution chambers, their lands turned over to German settler colonists, transforming the landscape of the Eastern European continent into a vast Germanic homeland, the scientific exploration of new weapons would have continued unabated, with engineers and scientists driven by fear of execution if they failed to deliver results. With ballistic missiles, capable of striking any target on Earth, being developed and perfected, chemical and biological weapons of unprecedented lethality being tested on human subjects drawn from the concentration camps, and ever more efficient nuclear arsenals being constructed to ensure German military invincibility for centuries to come. The Nazi regime would have established elaborate systems of racial administration, creating complex bureaucracies dedicated to the measurement, categorization, and processing of humanity according to racial principles, turning the entire European continent into a vast laboratory for racial engineering experiments that would have made the horrors of the actual Holocaust seem modest by comparison. By the 1950s or 1960s, in this alternate timeline, a global Nazi empire would have been firmly established, with the entire world divided into zones of German dominance and Japanese dominance, with the Western Hemisphere grudgingly accepted as an American sphere but perpetually threatened by Nazi expansion and subversion, creating a perpetually tense three-way division of the globe that would have been far more unstable than even the actual Cold War. The great cultural traditions of humanity, the art, music, literature, and philosophy that had emerged over millennia, would have been suppressed and replaced with Nazi kitsch, gigantic monuments to the glorious Aryan race dominating the skylines of European cities, pompous parades celebrating German superiority, marching through the streets every day, and propaganda that presented a grotesquely distorted version of history designed to justify Nazi rule forever and convince the enslaved populations that their oppression was not only deserved but necessary and righteous. The universities and research institutions that once pursued truth would have been transformed into propaganda mills and weapons laboratories, their libraries stripped of degenerate books and replaced with Nazi ideological texts, their faculty replaced with loyal party members who had risen through ideological purity rather than intellectual merit. The church would have been completely subordinated to the state, or eliminated entirely, with the regime's new pagan religion, synthesized from Germanic mythology and pseudo-scientific racial theory, serving as the spiritual framework for the Nazi state, and any religious practice that conflicted with state ideology ruthlessly suppressed. The family structure itself would have been transformed, with children separated from parents at young ages and raised in state institutions where they could be properly indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, free from the corrupting influences of parents who might harbor doubts about the regime's doctrines. Women would have been relegated to a strictly circumscribed role as breeders of racially pure German children, their access to higher education and professional careers eliminated, their entire existence devoted to perpetuating the racial community. Men would have been conscripted into endless military service or industrial labor, with no prospect of civilian life or retirement until death, their entire lives belonging to the state from birth until they were no longer useful. This alternate world, so dark and terrible, would have persisted until the fundamental contradictions inherent in any totalitarian system eventually forced some kind of reckoning. But by that time, centuries might have passed. Countless generations might have lived and died under totalitarian rule. The entire memory of freedom might have been lost to history, and the restoration of human dignity and democracy might have seemed impossible, even when the regime finally began to crumble. This is the world we must imagine to truly appreciate the magnitude of what was at stake in World War II, and why the sacrifice made to defeat Hitler was not only justified, but absolutely essential. As we contemplate this nightmarish alternate timeline, we are reminded of the profound importance of the actual history, a history in which millions died not for conquered territory or imperial glory, but for the fundamental principle that all human beings deserve to live in freedom and dignity, that democracy is worth defending, that human rights are not luxuries but necessities, that the values of the Enlightenment, reason, liberty, equality before the law, are worth fighting for, even at the most terrible cost. The veterans of World War II, those who survived the battlefields and labor camps and air raids, and all the horrors of that conflict, understood in their bones what we must never forget, that totalitarianism is not merely another form of government, one among many possibilities equally valid, but a fundamental evil that destroys everything beautiful and good in human civilization. They understood that some things are worth dying for, that freedom is worth more than comfort or safety, that standing against tyranny even in the face of overwhelming odds is the most profoundly human act possible. Their legacy is the free world in which we live today, imperfect though it may be, divided though it may be by politics and ideology and national interest, but still fundamentally committed to the principles of democracy and human rights that were won at such terrible cost during the Second World War. We honor their memory not by mere commemoration, but by remaining vigilant, by recognizing the warning signs of totalitarianism in our own time, by refusing to be complacent or apathetic in the defense of democracy, by understanding that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance. The alternate history of Hitler's victory serves as a cautionary tale that reminds us why democracy, for all its flaws and frustrations, must be fiercely protected and renewed in each generation.